here's one example of a Black woman who collaborated with European men for the express purpose of maintaining slavery so that she could get resources. And again, let me preface this. I'm not saying this is all Black women, but what we need to start to address is the fact that raccooning isn't just something that Black men do. There's always been men and women who were willing to engage in the status quo or were willing to sell it to people for money. Again, if we don't reckon with that, what happens is this kind of destructive behavior continues unaddressed. If we run with the narrative that Black women have always been loyal and they've never ever traded, there's never been times where they've fallen to raccooning. If you run with that narrative, then this destructive behavior, the ideas, the mindsets that would inspire a woman to sell it to people for money, that can continue unaddressed. And I think this is what we're seeing. So this is exactly why I'm talking about this. The backdrop of Black female loyalty is the history, right, of Black people in America, right? And for Black women, the history has been white men have had access to Black women literally since the plantation. Here's an example. This is from a musical, I think it's called Slave Play, which is just, that idea is horrible. But it is an example of what I just described, right? An example of what I described. The historical relationship between white men and Black women that goes all the way back to the plantation. Much of it forced, also some of it consensual. This is the backdrop. This is the American history. This is the foundational Black American history. However you want to spin it. This is the history of Black people in America. Because when you hear a woman talk about, now all of a sudden swirling, all of a sudden divesting, all of a sudden we're breaking new boundaries or barriers. Finally, white men are able to marry Black women, or finally people are able to mix. And finally, when all these ideas are going out to promote, to really, really, really push disgusting divesting, right? Like the disgusting side of it. It's a historical because, again, it overlooks the hundreds of years in America where this relationship has already been going on. Y'all understand me? So again, white men have had access to Black women since the plantation. Mixing of races has actually been a strategy. Let me turn your attention to this famous math equation, guys. This is not like this is not like a conspiracy theory. This is not made up. This is, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, who actually created a math problem that was all about how to breed out the Negro, or how to breed out Black people, essentially. He created a math problem. Here it is. Y'all can actually find it in the National Archives. If you have not seen it, literally type in Thomas Jefferson's math equation to breed out Black folks. But the whole idea, if you see, he kind of breaks it down mathematically, uses all the numbers, all that. The whole idea is basically through enough mixing, whether it be forced, right, or whether it be consensual, through enough mixing, you will eventually breed out Blackness. This is an idea, again, of a founding father, Thomas Jefferson, a person who owned slaves, right, who was very much pro-slavery, who profited off of it. And he believed that the way to eventually deal with the Black problem is to breed them out through mixing, through interracial sex. So again, I think this idea that exists, that just because a person will sleep with you of another race, just because they may even find you sexually attractive, doesn't mean at the end of the day, they are still not loyal to their political objectives, which excludes you, because we have scores and scores and scores of evidence of white men who did not like Black people, who did not believe that Black people should exist, didn't want them to exist, wanted them to be left away, wanted to do away with Black people in America, and they were still sleeping with Black women, partially as a military strategy, partially as a political strategy. This is not new. This has happened in other nations. You've seen it happen Latin America. This happened, parts of Asia, China, it happened. They did this in Australia, right? It is actually a political strategy sometimes for different powers that be to come into a nation, and as a way to try to dominate, to mix with the women, as a way to eventually, create, whether it's a trader class or trade a class of people who will be kind of confused between who they should be loyal to, and then eventually, through time, just breed out that particular culture. This has been going on for some time. What was the result of white men who chose to mix with Black women as a result to try to help maintain control, grow wealth, whatever. Now I want to turn your attention to Black female slave owners. Black female slave owners. This is not a really popular subject. This is not it's not a popular topic at all. Usually when you think about the traders in the Black community, quote unquote, those who sold those people out, right? Everybody wants to turn to the mister. Everybody likes to turn to the color purpling, what is it? Color purpling of Black America, right? The Black man who was out there, owning these slaves and just beating up people and just, oppressing them. Everybody likes to turn to the misters, the color purples. But in reality, that's very much a myth, because while there certainly were, there were Black slave owners and Black male slave owners, the majority of the slave owners that were Black were actually Black women. Actually, they were actually, yes, believe it or not, Black women.
That's weird.
And the thing about it is, this is something that's not really talked about. And again, let me preface this by saying, I'm not here saying that there was like an equal amount of Black slave owners and white slave owners. That's just not true. We know it was overwhelming majority of slave owners were not Black, right? But for the small percentage of those who were in those collaborators, they were overwhelmingly Black women. And the reason that's important is because many times the product of white men, again, white race or racist men or men who wanted to maintain political power control, many times the product of those white men who married Black women who wanted to work along with them was slavery, it was building an empire, and it was basically them coming together to be able to collaborate for the explicit purpose of maintaining power, for the explicit purpose of being able to maintain the empire, and in this case, to be able to purchase more slaves and get more money. So I want to give you, I just have a couple of examples, and there are more, but there's a couple of examples of Black female slave owners who, yes, actually collaborated with other European settlers at that time for the explicit purpose of engaging in the slave trade so that they could get money and they could get resources. I turn your attention right now to Madame Tinubu. She was a Yoruba woman. She was widowed after having 2 sons. In 1833, Tinubu, she remarried, I think, Adele, who was an exiled king from Lagos. With the marriage, she began to accumulate economic and political power. Using her husband's connections, she built a successful business trading slaves with Europeans. She was widowed again, but continued to expand her trade network by monopolizing slaves and palm oil and offering firearms obtained from the Europeans, which increased her wealth during the Yoruba Wars of the 1840s and 1850s. Also, you guys, it's important to note here, if you look at the 1840s and 1850s, she was engaging in the slave trade at the time that it was illegal. This is a whole other side point, but there's this idea that just because the international slave trade was like outlawed, I want to say it was 1808, that it just stopped and there weren't slaves being illegally trafficked over, but that's not true. As you can see, here's a prime example of a woman who was engaging in an illegal slave trade, making a ton of money off of it, and it was way past the fact that it was at least internationally banned here. So that's an important point to know. Again, she remained a major slave trader in the interior of Nigeria until her death in 1887. So here's one example of a Black woman who collaborated with European men. Here's one example of a Black woman who collaborated with European men for the express purpose of maintaining slavery and essentially maintaining white control so that she could get resources. Again, let me preface this. I'm not saying this is all Black women. But what we need to start to address is the fact that raccooning isn't just something that Black men do. For some reason, for some weird reason, we want to assume that any kind of raccooning has only been owned and has explicitly been ran by Black men, when history does not agree with that narrative. As I mentioned before, if you want to talk about black slave owners, if you really want to go down that route, majority of them are Black women. And yes, many of them were actually the byproduct of white men and Black or African women who came together and created mulattas, who eventually inherited slaves or eventually inherited the resources of their fathers, who happened to be white slave masters, and then they therefore took on the role of maintaining power. So again, here's one example of a Black female slave trader. Not popular, but it's out there. And if you Google her, it's funny because if you look at some articles, they're like, oh, you know, she was an amazing, shrewd businesswoman. Like some articles will really big her up. But I'm like, at the end of the day, you know, she was a businesswoman. She was a shrewd businesswoman at that time. It just so happened that big business at that time happened to be African bodies. So she's one example. I turn your attention to another example, Fenda Lawrence. Fenda Lawrence, she was a notable Gambian slave trader. She was a free Black woman and a relatively wealthy merchant who visited the American South in the second half of the 18th century, largely to trade slaves and other things. Her marriage to an English man gave her the chance to act as a go-between for the British and French traders and the local Africans. So again, here's an example of a woman of African ancestry who married into European families for the sole reason to actually now be an intermediary between the European settlers who wanted slaves and then the Africans who she had access to because she was an African woman. Fenda Lawrence. She actually came to the Americas and ended up touring the Americas, ended up touring different plantations and things of that nature as a freed woman, again, engaging in the slave trade, Black woman. Since her marriage to the Englishman gave her the chance to act as a go-between for the British and French traders and the local Africans. Fenda Lawrence traveled to the British North American colonies, now the United States, with respect and status as a person of color. At the time, she was described in some European sources as a considerable trader in the river of Gambia on the coast of Africa. Fenda Lawrence, again, what did she do? The reason she married, arguably, we can argue the reason that she married into a European family was so that she could actually help facilitate the slave trade. Why? Basically, as a reason to get money and resources. Remember, the slave trade was incredibly profitable at that time, incredibly profitable. So to be a shrewd business person in that time, to be a shrewd capitalist, right, at that time, would be to engage with African bodies. There's really no way around it. So this is exactly why she decided to marry and to collaborate into the family so that she could help sell out her people and then eventually get more money. Black female slave traders. So again, when we want to talk about Black women have always been loyal. History does not agree. History does not agree. There have always been examples of men and women who are willing to sell out their people for resources. Again, it's important to understand this. There's always been men and women who were willing to engage in the status quo or were willing to sell it to people for money. Again, if we don't reckon with that, what happens is this kind of destructive behavior continues unaddressed. If we run with the narrative that Black women have always been loyal and they've never ever traded, there's never been times where they've fallen to raccooning. If you run with that narrative, then this destructive behavior, the ideas, the mindsets that would inspire a woman to sell her people for money, that can continue unaddressed. And I think this is what we're seeing. So this is exactly why I'm talking about this. On to the next one. Mary Faber. Now, Mary Faber, she was born to African American FBA parents, financial Black Americans. Some of you guys like to call it Black Americans, whatever. She was born to some Black folks in America, right? They eventually moved elsewhere to establish themselves. Typo there. Then when she was of age, she married a white American ship owner named Paul Faber, who became a prominent slave trader in 1809. She worked diligently with her husband to maintain a profitable slave trade. There was reportedly 6,000 slaves on the Faber property in 1827. 6,000 evidently in 1827. And from my understanding, they pretty much did that throughout their entire life. They were quite profitable, obviously made a lot of money. She was largely involved in maintaining, because I guess story goes he traveled a lot, and so she handled one aspect of the business and where she stayed, and then a lot of times when he traveled he handled other aspects of the business, but they were both very much hands-on into basically maintaining their industry, their business, which happened to be slaves, Black African slaves. Again, a Black woman born of African American parents marries into a white family, marries into an English family at that particular time, an English slave trader, for the purpose of maintaining slavery, of selling out their people to get money. Now I turn your attention to Betsy Heard. She was a mixed woman. She was, as I mentioned before, remember where I said many of the Black female slave traders were the products of white slave owners and Black women, African women, many of them were. And sometimes those mixed mulatto women would end up inheriting property or inheriting aspects from their slave owning fathers. And they would then go on to maintain his property, his inheritance. Here's a prime example, Betsy Heard. She was a Euro-African. She was a mixed slave trader and merchant. Her father was an entrepreneur. Her mother was African. Heard's father sent her to England, most likely near Liverpool, for study. Upon completing her studies, she returned to West Africa and set up a trading post on the Faber River, following her father's trade. Eventually, she inherited her father's slave trading factory and connections. So again, as I mentioned before, remember when we talked about, at the beginning of this, we talked about how it has also been a strategy in the past for anytime, you had people who were trying to conquer a nation or maintain power control, how the colonizers or the people who were attempting to be in power would oftentimes go in and mix with the local women, that they would create mixed children, and then they would use those mixed children to help further expand the empire, right? This is exactly why Thomas Jefferson had created that math equation on how to help breed out Black people. I've said this before. We want to assume that Black women have always been loyal. History just does not agree with that narrative. I don't know how else to say that in a way that is not other than anything else in the truth. It's just not true. Like I said, there's always been men and women who have been willing to collaborate with the people in power at that time, even if it was at the expense of their own people. And those are examples in history of women who did it by literally marrying into the oppressors of their people so that they could actually get a piece of the pie. But I wanted to give you guys just a few examples of lovely Black women who certainly did not think that race loyalty was of importance. They wanted resources, and so they were willing to collaborate with the powers that be at that time to get the resources. Why is that important, you ask? Oh yes, it is a good question. It is important because that is still happening today. Again, this is still happening today. You still have women at the end of the day who are pretty much willing to do whatever to get the attention they want. At that time, the currency, it was Black bodies, it was slavery, that was a big business. Fast forward today, attention is a source of currency. Getting eyeballs, getting views, right? Getting attention, that is a form of currency today. So you have women who are willing to do pretty much anything to get attention, even if that means putting themselves in compromising positions or engaging in activities that are very self-hating. The same thing happens today. So again, if we want to say that Black women have always been so loyal, history does not agree with that narrative.